Well, thrilled to be here today. I want to thank the panelists, especially Michael and Deborah, ASU, for hosting what is always a really engaging and important set of conversations. This year, we're not all together, but the discussion has been no less engaging. So thanks, as always, for including us, and certainly an honor to be here with such an esteemed group of panelists. This is a conversation that is going to provide clarity around exactly what's happening in Washington. We've got experts like Lauren and Seth who can help you all to make sense of the noise, because they know exactly what's going on and have almost a crystal ball sense of how politics and policy are going to play out. We're extraordinarily lucky to have a serial state leader in Kim Hunter-Reid, who's doing some really remarkable work in Louisiana. And our thoughts and prayers are with you and your colleagues as you brace for yet another hurricane. Thank you for being with us today on the eve of another storm. I'd love to start off with Michael Collins, who's calling in from Cleveland. He is one of the senior leaders with JFF, a really remarkable organization that's doing important work across the education and workforce landscapes. And so he brings a really holistic view to this conversation. And rather than doing formal introductions at the outset, what I'd like to do is ask each of you the same question and maybe use that as an opportunity for some initial and introductory remarks. So Michael, we are in the midst of what so many of my colleagues have characterized as sort of twin pandemics, a mega healthcare crisis, and a long overdue reckoning on race and social justice. What trends are accelerating in 2020? How are things evolving, again, across the landscape, given your really comprehensive view? What should people be looking out for from a public policy standpoint? What's maybe stagnating that we think should be accelerating? Can you maybe just set the stage for us with a high-level overview?
Sure, happy to do that. So, JFF, we've been working to transform the nation's education and workforce development system for over 35, 36 years. And, I've been fortunate to be at the organization for a decade and a half. And in that work, as we have worked across the country on transformation, I've done a lot of work in completion reform, working with large completion initiatives. And so I just want to ground my remark in kind of the work that the national, kind of post-secondary workforce development reform community, some of that work that they've been doing. And I think, the trends, really, we've been working in many ways in two separate sectors, right? And what we're seeing with COVID, that statistic that, that we all, kind of bandy about, that 2/3 of all jobs will, will require some post-secondary education, that has come into very, very sharp relief with the dramatic acceleration of the importance of skills. And it's really interesting because as we've worked at the national level on post-secondary reform, we are largely, there's the specter of the college completion agenda, right? College for all. And while we were transitioning to get kind of closer connections to post-secondary and work, it's really clear that we were not as closely connected as a system, and we really were, kind of underprepared. So mission critical became the importance of skills and shorter term opportunities to get people into kind of jobs now. That is certainly not what kind of the broader college completion agenda was designing for, right? We were designing for longer term. We were designing in some ways rationally, right? Trying to make kind of kind of projected projections to the workforce, and all that with the pandemic and the spike in unemployment really went away. So like, what were we designing for, right? We didn't know where the jobs were going to be, and so that brought into sharp relief the lack of a connected post-secondary and workforce system that could really be responsive to our needs. And so moving forward, I think that one of the lessons is that we have to really accelerate kind of that integration of kind of post-secondary and workforce. And frankly, I'll share a little bit later, I think that the other piece of this is with the advent of the importance of skills and the transition from the college completion agenda. We were telling everybody, go to college, go to college, go to college, and now we're saying skills, skills, skills. We have dramatically increased the complexity of kind of the post-secondary options and training options. And I think a lot of people who don't have experience in our post-secondary systems, a lot of kind of people who are struggling in our economy really need support to navigate this new complex system that we find ourselves in. I think what's really gone altogether in terms of trends really is frankly any notion that you can just kind of go to college like and everything be okay, right? We're seeing that that didn't happen. But also what's really important that I think that we need to talk about is that there was a dramatic difference in our ability to kind of weather kind of the employment, right? And that also has to do with the split between kind of some of the shorter term and longer term. So moving forward, I'll just close and say our opportunity is really going to be how we create a policy infrastructure that is going to connect some of the shorter term opportunities with longer term opportunities. And I think that there are some real, equity implications there. And, I think we have to just own and be accountable for the reality that that there's work to do with our education and post-secondary systems for them to be, essentially modernized to be able to meet the moment.
Really appreciate that feedback. I think that sense of urgency around the relevance, cost, speed with which individuals can acquire not just credentials but skills that are relevant to the labor market is something we're all feeling very acutely. Seth, you have as a former labor secretary, acting labor secretary, former U.S. deputy secretary, you have a really unique, I think, view of the labor market. So same maybe question, what's accelerating, what's stagnating, but would be grateful if, and maybe even as a segue to Kim, to maybe talk a little bit about what is the state of the labor market. I think a lot of people have a hard time making sense of the statistics and the various numbers we all read about on CNBC or in the Wall Street Journal or wherever else. So can you just maybe put it in a historic context? And again, in addition to talking about trends, give us a sense of where the labor market is right now.
Sure, and I want to build off Michael's very important comments. We entered this pandemic recession with calling it a system is a little bit too generous. We had multiple systems that didn't really integrate with one another. Each of those systems is rather grossly underfunded. They were not producing the desired outcomes. We have a completion problem, not merely in the college system, but also in the workforce system. So that's where we were in February. Then in March, the worst economic downturn really since the Great Depression hit us, and the worst jobs recession since the Great Depression hit us. And we are very, very slowly crawling our way back. I'll just throw a couple of numbers out. I don't want to rely too heavily on statistics here, but just to give you a sense, we have 10 million fewer jobs now than we had in February. We have 25.5 million Americans on some kind of an unemployment benefit right now as of last week. And there are were in September, 3.8 million workers who lost a job and don't have that job to go back to. They're referred to by my friends at the Bureau of Labor Statistics as permanently furloughed. So take Michael's comments about where the systems are, add in the fact that they were already grossly under-resourced, and now we have millions more people who are going to need the kind of navigation help that Michael was talking about, support for them to engage in skills training, help to pursue degrees. The system and this is a time because of COVID where many systems like the unemployment insurance system, our healthcare system, and others are overburdened. That's what we're facing in my opinion, in the skills development systems that we have, the unintegrated systems that we have, that they're going to be asked to serve very large numbers of people, largely dislocated workers, but also there are going to be a lot of folks coming out of K-12 and coming out of higher education in some form who are simply going to need help navigating a new workplace environment, because we'll have a different mix of occupations in our economy. Some industries have shrunk dramatically and are not going to fully recover. Some have grown dramatically. Technology, online retail, and others have grown very dramatically. And so there's going to be a different mix, and it is not transparent to students and workers exactly where they should go because of some of the lack of coordination that Michael was talking about. So I hate to sound like the Grim Reaper. I like to think of myself as the person who describes the actions of the Grim Reaper rather than actually being the Grim Reaper. But you know, we're in a terrible challenge right now, and it's going to require a whole of government and whole of private sector effort to try to put the resources and the navigational systems and the skills development systems in place that'll serve the people who needed it before and the millions more who need it now.
Thanks, Seth. That's incredibly helpful. And maybe just, so if Michael helps set the table by talking a bit about what's happening at the intersection of education and the labor market, and Seth gave us the labor market perspective, perhaps we can go clockwise, at least it's clockwise on my screen, and turn to the commissioner. Dr. Hunter Reed, you're running a higher education system in the state of Louisiana. Curious what you're seeing in terms of not just policy trends, and I know we were talking earlier, you're in the midst of a legislative session, but also the trends and perspectives of education consumers, and how and whether the prospective students and learners that you're seeing across that continuum are evolving in response to the pandemic and the profound shifts that we're seeing in the labor market and the broader workforce.
Sure, happy to do that. Thank you for the ability to participate. So I would say that to Michael and Seth's points, absolutely. I think what we see is that pre-COVID, it was not a transparent, collaborative system, coordinated system. In the middle of COVID, it's even more challenging, right? So it's even harder and it's even more urgent that we get this right. So our institutions are certainly working hard to educate students. You know, you had a pandemic hit, and within 2 weeks, we turned the battleship to online remote learning, something that people did not think we would be able to do. We do have haves and have-nots regarding digital divide, but we were able to move that battleship, if you will, out of necessity. What we see now, certainly as soon as COVID hit, we had about 400,000 people unemployed. The greatest impact were women and minorities in terms of harm from the economic impact from COVID, and certainly health disparities as well. And so now we have a responsibility to try to help displaced workers to find their way, as Seth was saying, in a process where you're not really sure what does the economy need now. You're not really sure how to navigate, how to match your aptitude and interest to the world of work, how to afford it. Our community colleges have been down in terms of enrollment. They work the phones, talk to students who are parents, and they say, there's not enough certainty around my child's school. They're, hybrid, or they're going one day, not going another. I lost the 2 part-time jobs that helped me to pay to come to school. And so there's a huge misery factor in terms of just trying to get through the day in this pandemic. We have a triple challenge in Louisiana, as you've mentioned: the pandemic, racial reckoning, and continued hurricanes. And so all of that, I think, has given us a greater sense of urgency in trying to get a system that serves people well, but recognizing that there are a lot of people who were displaced, who have been displaced pre-COVID. Almost 47% of our population, our working population, had a high school diploma or less as their highest credential. And so we were already beating the drum that we needed to increase credentials, talent, skills. that we needed to address equity gaps, that we needed to make sure we had a more affordable pathway and a more clear pathway for students, young or young at heart. And so all of that, I think, sits where we are now in terms of how do you figure this out in a way that is responsive to learners and helps them to really find a path forward. And that is the work that we're doing each and every day here in Louisiana, and certainly our colleagues are across the country.
Thank you for that, Commissioner. And so, Lauren, what's Washington doing to help out our fearless state leaders? Can you give us a sense of we've got lots of questions for you, and I'm sure we'll have many more.
Solve all of Kim's problems down in the
Former,
I wish.
Yes, please. Yes, please.
former
Kim, I
Oh.
don't know what keeps you up at night, but I don't know how you're getting any sleep. You've got a lot on your plate. So kudos to you, and thank you for your leadership. Thank you all. It's great to be with you. So yeah, I mean, Congress isn't solving any of these problems right now, sad to say. We were just talking before we went live here about whether or not there'll be another relief package, and I don't think, that there will be until, after the election. And I think, in terms of Speaker Pelosi, I think she's going to wait and see if the Senate flips, and if Vice President Biden, wins the White House. And I think you'll see a much bigger package along the lines of what House Democrats have been proposing, if that's the case. So, so I think we're just in a wait and see. The House is sort of in session, although members are back home and campaigning. The Senate is out for a couple weeks. They'll be back. They're doing virtual hearings on, the Supreme Court nominee. But, I think we'll know soon enough, and they'll be back in November to hopefully finish some unfinished business. But again, I think dependent on the election results, we'll see what can get done by the end of the calendar year. It could be that they kick a lot of this stuff to the new year and for a new Congress to deal with, which is not the way to govern, but it's happened before, so I wouldn't be surprised if it happens again. So I would just say, though, on the whole education to workforce landscape, it is one area, maybe the only area right at the moment, where there is bipartisan support for. So, in fact, just last month, Chairman Bobby Scott of the House Education and Labor Committee just marked up the National Apprenticeship Act of 2020. That is a piece of legislation that has not been updated since 1937. So it's high time for that. It will probably be a next Congress to do item. And as well, this administration, since day one, has made expanding, work-based learning opportunities a priority. In fact, since the president signed an executive order in 2018, about 400 companies and organizations have pledged to create about 16 million new education and on-the-job learning opportunities. So that's been a focus too. So it is an area of bipartisanship, but I hope that Congress focuses on some key things. I don't know whether it's going to be in the context of the Higher Education Act reauthorization. That legislation has been eligible for reauthorization since 2013. They just haven't been able to do it yet. But one example is transfer of credits. I mean, it's ridiculous how hard it is for students to transfer credits. And if they see a different program at a different school and they need to want to transfer, we should make it easy for them to do that. I think another area that's of concern is, and I'll end here, is financial stability of schools. I think there are a lot of these schools that aren't going to make it out of the pandemic. So you're going to see some closures, you're going to see some mergers and acquisitions. And my hope is that through all of that, these decisions, that students are first and foremost top of mind. We just need to make sure that they can finish programs, they can transfer, that sort of thing. But I know it's an area we need to look at. And I think until these enrollment numbers get posted at the department, they're not really sure what they're looking at. So there's a lot to do, but hopefully it'll be a busy new Congress, because I don't anticipate that a lot is going to get done, except must-do items before the end of the calendar year.
Well, I'd love to dig in and maybe we can assess. Maybe just stick with you for a minute, but like programs like or concepts like short-term Pell. Is that something we're likely to see? What are the look out over maybe say 6 months in a year? What are the big shifts that either people are talking a lot about that aren't going anywhere, or that maybe people aren't paying as close attention to, and they should be? And I'd like to maybe I'll just foreshadow. I'd like to, after that, I want to come back to Commissioner Hunter Reed, and I want to ask, where does Washington need to help, and where does it need to get out of the way? And Michael, I want to ask you a similar question, really, from the context of where you see some of the more promising innovations as someone who's on the forefront of innovation. So Lauren, I'm going to give.
Yeah, sure. I'll just start with, I think that one of the biggest issues is, of course, the student loan debt, which is north of 1.5 trillion right now. And I think the number of Democrats on the Hill proposed, erasing some of this debt. Again, I think the election results will sort of determine which way they go on that. We do have to lower the cost of tuition. Families are struggling, so we need to find ways to make college more affordable. I think there's got to be a focus on broadband. We need to have it everywhere for everybody. So access for that. I think short-term training programs is huge. I think one of the other panelists talked about the need for that as well. I think, Michael, you did in your opening, and I think that's important. So, there's a lot to do, and so anyway, I'm hopeful that I think they were close actually earlier this year to getting some sort of a Higher Education Act reauthorization, at least proposal on the table in the Senate, but I just, time ran out, et cetera. So, but I'm hopeful.
Terrific. Dr. Hunter Reed, over to you. Where does
Sure.
help? Where do they need to get out of the way?
Thank you. So I agree with Lauren. I think that if we are now at a place where remote learning is the way it's going to happen, that we clearly have to think about broadband like we do basic infrastructure, lights and water. And everyone needs to have that access. Individual communities, rural communities, urban communities, and states will not be able to solve that problem alone. And so we do need a national agenda to get that done. So that needs to happen. I appreciate Lauren's comment about thinking about the fact that a credential now is no longer a luxury, but a necessity. So how do you think about getting everyone that credential, whether it's more credentials for high school students, high school redesign, whether it's adult financial aid and helping adult short-term credentials? This idea of the states can't be in the silos, the policies can't be in the silos, and the resources can't be in the silos. And so how do we leverage and knit together the kinds of resources that allow us to say, here is the big vision. Everyone having access to a credential of value, everyone having the technology that allows them to do that. The nation taking on the issue of healthcare shortage for workers, taking on the issue of teachers, taking on the issue of STEM. Now, if those are national priorities, then how do we wrap our resources and our thought leadership around an agenda to get that done? And so I think that's the way to do this, to get out of the silos, to get out of the red meat politics and get focused on solutions, really driving solutions and bringing people together to solve big challenges that will help our state and strengthen our nation and really support our families. Very important.
Really appreciate that thoughtful feedback. And so Michael, what are the promising innovations? What's happening that should give us hope? Hopeless.
I think there's a lot happening, and I appreciate Lauren's comment about some positive things that are underway, and I totally agree with what she said. One of the things that I would offer in terms of innovation, a lot of the discussion, even my framing today, is really around how we are approaching kind of post-secondary and workforce development from kind of our current systems. And so some of the innovation really is we need to be thinking about, kind of out of systems, right? So, JFF is partnering with some other organizations working on Skill Up, and Skill Up is it's a platform where a web platform where people can go for the navigation supports that I was talking about. You say you've lost a job, there's a place you can go. It helps you identify, career pathways and opportunities. It actually identifies employers. There are employers that are partnering. There are higher education institutions that are partnering. And so there are both in-system, there's in-system redesign and improvement that has to happen and that, great work that's being done by the commissioner and others to increase that alignment. But I also think that we need to think about some of these newer kind of innovative, tech-enabled kind of new economy strategies that also I think are really important, and they haven't been as considered. As the commissioner was talking about kind of the red meat politics, our systems, in many ways, are doing the work they need to do to support their systems, right? Which reinforces silos. But if we can partner, if these systems can partner with some of the social entrepreneurs and other opportunities out there, I just wonder where we can get. And it doesn't have to be either or, it can be in partnership. Now, there are states that are, approaching this work very innovatively. I think about programs like Fast Forward in Virginia, that has identified a short set of, they've curated, here's some high demand programs, for industry-based, credentials. Here's some financial support to get there. Here's some counselors to help you make sense of which ones might be for you. So there is, so that is happening at the state level also. But one of the things when we talk about innovation, one of the things that we don't talk about really are, I think, some of the bigger levers, right? So we've spent billions and billions of dollars on our post-secondary and workforce development systems, right? And I think that, because of the shift, as I talked about before, to where we have said, go to college, go to college, go to college, and now we're saying get skills, get skills, get skills. I think we really have to build a bridge, right? How do we build a policy infrastructure that connects some of those short-term opportunities? Like, so for example, when COVID happened, the unemployment spiked and people essentially, they lost their job. They just had to work, right? You have to deal with that. You have to work with where people are. So how do we connect those, those lifeboat jobs, those jobs that people could get, whether they were, good or not so good, right? The jobs they can get, how are those jobs connected to the short-term credential opportunities that are popping up, the training opportunities that are popping up? Can those opportunities help those workers who in many cases are low-wage workers kind of advance to other opportunities? So I think that there is work to be done and innovation around policy supports to connect some of the shorter-term training to longer-term opportunities. And I think that, again, I don't know if we'll have time to talk about it today, but I think that there are tremendous implications for equity because of the disproportionate number of low-wage workers who are Black and Latinx, right? And who are disproportionately more likely to have a sub-baccalaureate, credential. So there are just a lot of equity implications in there as well.
Well, I want to stick with that for a minute, and then I'm going to turn back to Seth. And I'm getting some questions. I'm going to take them out of order. But the apropos of what you were just sharing, Michael, Opportunity at Work has done some interesting research, which suggests that there are millions and millions of Americans that don't four-year degrees, but nevertheless have the skills that would enable them to thrive in higher wage work. You and I have talked a little bit about how and whether college degree requirements and hiring might have exacerbate inequities that are that already exist across our educational infrastructure. So I'd love to just ask you to talk a little bit about the implications of the Opportunity at Work research, and maybe just take a question head on, which is, do college degree requirements in hiring hold workers back? Do they inhibit economic mobility?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. The other panelists may want to have a crack at this too, because this is the question, right? So I think we have to be really careful. If a job legitimately requires a post-secondary, a bachelor's or whatever, and it is valid, that is what it is, right? What we are talking about is employers posting job requirements that require, say, a bachelor's degree, and there are current people working in that job and are successful and do not have a bachelor's degree, right? Like, so there's a difference between, I think, a job that legitimately requires a credential, and then the equity implication there is, do people of color, right, have access to those opportunities to get those credentials, right? There's equity there, but then there's also equity if you have equity issues around low-income people, people of color who don't have an academic pedigree, who are screened out of opportunities for work that they are clearly qualified to do. So I think that there absolutely are corporate hiring practices, right, that have created barriers for workers, right? But I think that it's really important that we don't send a message that bachelor's degrees are not important because of the equity implications. So when I talked earlier, those of us that had bachelor's degrees and higher, we rode out the pandemic, or we are riding out the pandemic in dramatically different fashion, right, than many of the people who are driving to our homes to deliver our dinners, right? Like, and who were working in grocery stores. So I think that it's just really critical for us to get this right, this balance right. Skills are incredibly important. And if somebody is qualified for a job, an inflated credential requirement is discriminatory. Regardless of intent, the effect is discriminatory. At the same time, we need our post-secondary education system and workforce development system to help people advance to credentials, right, including bachelor's degrees and even graduate degrees, if in fact those credentials are required for the good jobs that pay family supporting wages, that have benefits, and in the case of COVID, right, that were more likely to be able to be performed at home.
Well, really appreciate it. I think if you haven't checked it out, that STARS research has major implications. I think that category of workers will continue to become increasingly well-defined in that terminology used. Seth, you were appointed and served as acting labor secretary in 2013. Let's say you were labor secretary in January. It's January 15th, 2021. What are your top priorities? What are the priorities for the office?
Well, I'm tempted to use Morris Udall's old line, which is if nominated, I'll flee to Mexico, and if confirmed, I'll fight extradition. But let's just use it as a thought experiment. And I think a lot of what we've talked about on this panel is very important, but then there is what is also urgent. The most urgent thing is going to be to pass a huge jobs investment program, regardless of who is elected president on November 3rd. And the task for folks like us is to ensure that there is a skills development and job placement infrastructure connected to that jobs program that sort of seizes the opportunity created by the crisis, that will ensure that the equity issues that Michael is talking about, that the geographic disparities that we experience and that some of the folks in Louisiana experience are addressed as a part of that jobs legislation. We don't want the investments merely to go to the coasts. We don't want it to merely be subsidies for more middle-class white kids to be able to go to college. We want it to be a vehicle for ensuring that everybody can participate in whatever the next generation of growth is going to be in the jobs market. And there's a long list of things that need to get solved in a very short period of time. And Lauren has talked about two bills that need to be reauthorized, the Higher Ed Act and the National Apprenticeship Act. I would throw in a third, which is the Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act, which is the act that runs or authorizes the public workforce system as well as the vocational rehabilitation system, Job Corps, the Perkins system, and others. So you're not going to reauthorize three large pieces of legislation as part of a jobs program, but trying to build the kinds of reforms that we've talked about into a jobs legislation, focus on work-based learning, focused on developing apprenticeship, focused on greater transparency, both for employers and for workers, about what credentials are going to succeed, particularly if they are not degree-based credentials, because I completely agree with Michael that there's a heavy over-reliance on bachelor's degrees in hiring. and that we ensure that there is the requisite funding so that workers of all kinds are going to be able to not only get the skills that they need in order to be able to get these jobs that Congress and the president are going to invest in, but also that they get the wraparound services that make it possible for them to do the job training and the job that they're preparing for. You know, childcare, healthcare, elder care, leave systems. All of that is going to be critically important to ensuring that we don't just in the short term create some jobs in order to spark the economy, but that we accomplish some long-term reform out of an urgent situation.
Really appreciate that. And just one quick follow on. So President Trump passed signed an executive order de-emphasizing the role of the college degree, or that directed federal agencies to de-emphasize the role of the degree in hiring and to focus instead on skills. Does that stand? Is that top on anyone's list to remove in a Biden administration?
No, I don't think. Let me just say the list of executive orders that the Biden folks want to overturn is really long. I don't see that happening in week one or month one or maybe even year one. Without knowing the details, you'd want to keep that spirit alive, ensure that you're not merely doing the kind of credential inflation that Michael was talking about and saying that a bachelor's degree is essentially a proxy for readiness for every job in our economy. It clearly is not, both because the bachelor's degree doesn't confer all the skills that you need, but also because there are many, many other people in our economy who can access and succeed in these jobs who don't have bachelor's degrees. So I'm not sure that's going to be a priority 1 or 100 if there is a Biden administration.
That's really helpful. And Commissioner Hunter-Reid, so when you hear concerns about up-credentialing, questions about how and whether college degree requirements might exacerbate inequities that are pervasive in maybe our K-12 as well as our post-secondary system, I'm just curious to get your take and reaction to that as a state higher ed leader in particular, but also as the leader of a state that's doing, you've got the Compete LA Academy, which incorporates really interesting public-private partnerships with providers like Straighterline. I mean, you all are doing some incredibly innovative work. You did really innovative work in Colorado previously. So just curious what you're seeing is some of the most innovative public-private partnerships, and just in general to get your reaction to maybe what I think often might come through as a sense that higher education isn't adapting to the needs of the labor market and into how the workforce is evolving.
So I would say that it's a two-way street, and neither organization, higher ed, the higher ed ecosystem, the workforce ecosystem, neither one of us have it right. So yes, I think Michael's point is an important one. If we are signaling that the bachelor's is critical and then not providing people with a path, then there's a challenge there, right? It's the same challenge that I see when I visit with students and say, you got to get the credential, you got to get the credential. And they say, if it's a necessity, then why do you price it as a luxury good? Why can't everyone get access to it? These are the fundamental issues that we have to talk about. So I want to make sure that individuals who need access to credentials get them, but that the credential has value in the workplace, and that the credential signals what an individual can do and knows, and that it's stackable. So the bachelor's is a proxy for learning, right? It doesn't tell you with granularity what a student can do. But Michael is right, many businesses, and we had many conversations about this in Colorado, many businesses use it to get you through 2 hoops of HR before you can potentially get an interview. And so I do think there's a necessity for more transparency around competencies and skills and credentials. There is a necessity for more transparency around how to get on a pathway and what the pathway looks like, your time and your money to the world of work. So there's work to do in all of that. And of course, we have significant equity gaps. So we have to have our mind and our mind's eye on those issues as well. So all of that, I think, is important work and exciting work for us to do. But there is so much urgency, as Seth mentioned right now, because this economy is so challenged. People are so challenged right now, and they need support and help. And so we have to make sure we're doing that. Institutions this is our mission, to serve our students well. And so we do need to make sure we're coming together with workforce, with business and industry, with innovation, with technology, to think about what is the next level of education and skill that individuals will need. How do we make sure that when you cross that commencement stage, that you have a credential that has value, that's stackable, and allows you to speak to what you can do as an individual?
Really appreciate that. I think we've just got a few minutes left, and I want to make sure I get in each of the questions. I want to take a minute to thank the panelists in case we get cut off. Lauren, what are the questions refers to this concept that Strata Education Network and Kale, along with the Ford Foundation, have looked at, which is this idea of creating a 401k-like program, sort of a portable funding account for learning. Aspen Institute has some tax credit proposals. There've been talk about reforming the Section 127 tax benefits, that the two-sided benefit that providers like Guild and major employers like Walmart are using. Ultimately, when we think about these alternative accelerated training programs, maybe that exist outside of traditional degree pathways, including stackable pathways like we're seeing in places like Louisiana, or providers like CHCP, just at a high level, what are we likely to see the passage into law in a more expansive way of LEOA-like individualized training accounts or new forms of liquidity? I know we talked a little bit earlier about short-term Pell, but are we going to see real, not just more money, but new approaches to financing education?
So a couple things. First, listening to Kim gives me great hope to have state leaders like Kim and where she's focused. I have to say, so kudos to you first, because so much good work is being done, frankly, at the state level. I don't want to talk about the lack of leadership in DC at the moment, but I'm just encouraged by people like Kim. So thanks for your leadership there. I think, when Congress, so I think whenever they do a bill, of course, they're looking to have it be sort of budget neutral, right? So every time they move the levers, if you will, there's either a cost to it or there's a savings to it. And so when they look at all of these proposals, I mean, they might be very meritorious, but when it comes down to dollars and cents, they make choices about what they can and cannot afford, and do they have the budget wherewithal to go there. So I think they're looking at, ISAs, the income share agreements. That's been sort of an issue that's been bounced around Capitol Hill and talked about in a bipartisan way.